With Diablo 2 Resurrected entering version 2.4 soon and getting some balance changes, I wanted to get some of the builds that are likely to receive a boost in power done, so we'd at least have a good point of reference for the PTR. The first of these is the Fire Druid, as decided indirectly by a poll, but be sure to keep an eye on the channel if you want to see any of the other builds that may be heavily impacted by this upcoming patch. The Fire Druid is often seen as the weaker of the two Elementalist Druid builds, and with good reason. All of its skills have a casting delay, and its physical damage output with the fire spells is nothing compared to Tornado. There is also the perception that fire has more immunities than the other elements, which is false, since while there are more fire-resistant enemies, the number of immunities between fire, cold, and lightning are actually not that far off of each other. It's just that lightning is easier to break, and cold mastery makes non-immunes trivial for the sorceress, while there are no real equivalents for the fire characters before the end of the game. But since this is an endgame build, we can mess around with that, and you can probably see in the background we're actually showing off two different equipment options. Since the flexibility needed to do all areas of the game, we kinda needed it. Though, before we dive into the juicy stuff, let's get the basics out of the way. Stats are quite literally enough strength for equipment and then the rest into vitality. You can go max block, but I opted not to since I'm using the Bear Barrier for self-defense and more physical damage, so I didn't really need to get that little bit of extra protection for myself, but if you go higher dex, you do have more weapon options. Now, skill-wise, you've probably already picked up that we're using summons with this. In my case, higher level Bear for a solid bit of physical damage and tanking, as well as Oak Sage for a life boost, since we're doing a long run for testing purposes and rebuffing with battle orders would get on my nerves. Though Call to Arms and Spirit on swap would be what you want while running the specific areas, with the gear kind of oriented towards that area. As far as our main skills, that's where some people will love it and others will hate it. Since I opted to use bears, I also decided to go for the more targeted fire skills, namely 20 points in Firestorm, Molten Boulder, Fissure, and Volcano. And you will use all 4 of them if you're planning to run every area in the game, with Volcano and Molten Boulder being your answer for fire immunes thanks to their reasonable physical damage output, and Firestorm and Fissure being your answer to, well, everything else. If you decide not to go with a high-level bear and instead go with a level 1 bear, you will be giving up some defensive assistance and physical damage, but you can invest in Armageddon instead to make Volcano more broadly useful thanks to increasing its fire damage even further, as well as giving you a semi-passive fire blizzard of sorts. That said, if you go that route, Armageddon will usually be your lowest priority to recast unless you're doing the running druid build, which basically plays like a blaze sorceress and may not even use any summons at all. Equipment-wise, let's start with the mercenary. As usual, we want resist and life leech on him, so Chains of Honor or Fortitude and Vampire's Gaze go in. You could go with some different helmets as well, but weapon-wise, you may have noticed I was lazy earlier, and I just used Insight from the Wind Druid build setup. This is unnecessary since the casting delay on most of the fire skills, you'll rarely run into low mana, even without meditation, so I swapped to Reaper's Toll just to speed up things in fire immune dense areas. As far as the aura choice, I would go with Holy Freeze as my first pick, though you can go with Might to keep him alive and have him and the bear do more physical damage. Both work quite well, and I actually am using Might on mine in particular for the bear. And if you want a more budget option, a Lawbringer Act 5 mercenary can be a solid pick as well, since the proper aura for this build is not super important, and it can be easier to obtain that source of Decrepify. On our equipment though, I actually have a dual setup here, a fire damage oriented one for most areas, then a skill booster for areas with a lot of fire immunes like Chaos Sanctuary, and I chose these with the goal of not having to swap anything other than weapons and shield, which actually worked out quite well. So the non-changing equipment should be fairly straightforward. Lots of plus skills, with the obvious Stones of Jordan's for our rings, for keeping the mana up and giving us stronger spells, Arachnid Mesh for being the only plus skills belt that works here, and Mara's for resistance skills as well, though you could also go with a Druid Caster Amulet if you wanted and had one accessible. Boot-wise, there were not any skill choices, so we just went with the bog standard War Travelers for a pinch of Magic Find, even though it wasn't a priority, but thankfully we did have the option of Mage Fist for gloves to inch up all of our fire skills just a pinch, as well as give us a bit more mana regen so we don't actually need Insight. A more controversial choice I made was to go Chains of Honor instead of Enigma. That's mostly because this type of run, I actively avoid teleporting around so the build can try to perform in every area possible. And generally the areas you'd be farming with the Fire Druid, you wouldn't need it either, since they're actually better at farming monster dense areas for bases and runes, rather than farming bosses for uniques and sets. The last piece of fixed equipment, outside of the charms which are all plus skills, is Ravenlore, the rarely used Sky Spirit Druid Pelt, which pretty much is designed explicitly for the Fire Druid. And while you could use a +5 Volcano or +5 Fissure rare pelt, they honestly wouldn't really compare to Ravenlore thanks to that minus enemy fire resistance perk on it, which you could take further with a Rainbow Facet if you wanted, but that more than makes up for the 2 skill point difference you'd get from even the best rare helm, since it actively combats the generally higher base fire resists. The variable equipment, though, comes in the weapons and shields. First, the stuff you'll use if you're running areas with a lot of fire immunes will actually be the more cliche caster setup, Heart of the Oak and Spirit. This is to get you resists, mana, and plus skills, since against fire immunes, your resistance piercing will be useless, and you'll want more plus skills to get that physical damage as high as possible for whenever your mercenary procs Decrepify. So a big +5 from this setup is just what the doctor ordered for this odd situation to take a fire caster into. Why you'd take it into a fire immune area, I don't know, though these plus skills are also good for casting your bear and oak. Our swap is way better for less fire resistant areas though. And that is because it's dual Phoenix with a whopping minus 56% fire resist. It does way more than plus skills ever could for non-fire immune enemies. You could also go with Hand of Justice for a weapon and a Phoenix shield if you wanted some ping damage. You'd only lose 8% of this fire resist reduction and still usually top off your life and mana each time redemption goes off, and you'd actually have that holy fire going. It wouldn't be high level holy fire, but it would be a little bit of extra damage. Overall, this build is super expensive, but better than most people give it credit for when compared to similarly equipped characters. Is it currently S tier? No, but it is fully capable of completing every key area of the game without skipping any enemies, which is something even builds like Blizzard Sorceresses can't claim.